Welcome to episode 85 of the Ask Historians podcast. This episode is titled In Search of the Taíno. While many listeners are likely familiar with the Taíno, it's unlikely that they know that they're familiar with the Taíno. That's because while the Taíno certainly don't have the same name recognition as the Inca, the Maya, the Aztecs, and other more famous or popular indigenous civilizations, the Taíno are very common in media representations of the colonization, especially the initial arrival of Columbus and his men in the Caribbean, because they were the first indigenous group that Columbus and his men encountered. However, as our guest today, Antonio Curet, curator and archaeologist at the Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., will explain, the term Taíno itself is questionable at best, and many of these depictions are, perhaps unsurprisingly, not very accurate. With that said, let's take a moment to run our monthly book giveaway. Those who contribute to us on Patreon at patreon.com/AskHistorians are entered to win a book during our monthly book giveaways. This month, William Ryan won. Congratulations, William. You have a choice between one of the four following books. One is by our recent AMA guest, Jonathan Sperber. Professor Sperber, wrote Karl Marx, A 19th Century Life. Now, this is not a smear of Marx. This is not an attempt to make him a saint. This is not a work of politics. This is not about his politics. Well, it is about his politics, but it is not a work of politics. It's a work of history. It's a serious investigation of the study of Karl Marx's life and thought, and is in fact very critical of him. And I would highly recommend it to any listeners who are interested in finding out more about how Marx thought and why he thought what he thought, and about his life. Another book that is up for, this month is Janet Abou-Lughad's Before European Hegemony, The World System, AD 1250 to AD 1350. I'm reading it right now, and it's very well written, very clear, and it's a fascinating look at the economic system in the Old World, in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries, and how these regions were interconnected. Usually, books about the modern world start in the 16th century, and Abou-Lughad's position is that they're starting too late. They need to search for the roots of the modern takeoff of Europe, economically speaking, in the 13th and 14th centuries, and the economic system that was in place at that time. I would highly recommend it as well. A book that is mentioned several times in the podcast today is Irving Rouse's The Taínos, The Rise and Decline of the People Who Greeted Columbus. The book itself is dated, and certain sections are more than a little technical, more than a little dense. However, it still today is one of the better books out there on the Taíno as a people. Unfortunately, much of the literature on these people is in overly specialized texts, which are tucked away in academic journals and the like, and it's hard to find a good scholarly work which is also accessible. This has sections which are not entirely accessible, but is for the most part an accessible introduction to the Taíno. The final book up for the raffle today is The Bull of Minos by Leonard Cottrell. Leonard Cottrell is not a historian himself or an archaeologist. He's a journalist, but he wrote a really interesting book. It was very well written many years ago about the people who discovered Troy, the ancient city of Troy, the Minoan civilization, which is this ancient civilization in Crete, which many people didn't know existed until it was rediscovered in the early late 19th, early 20th centuries, and Mycenaean civilization, which is the civilization that grew up in what is today Greece before classical Greek civilization ended up taking over. And it is a very well-written book. It's a very fascinating book. Certain sections honestly gave me goosebumps just for how fascinating they are, and how it's one of those books where for some people it'll either inspire a passion in history, or it will rekindle that flame, just because of that sense of discovery and wonder, and the way the author is taking you to look into these civilizations, which through their archaeological remains, it's all very well written, it's all very well done. I'd highly recommend it as well. As a final note before the podcast begins, I'm going to add that this episode is not really about the Taíno after the conquest, or about the conquest or the process of colonization as such. This episode almost exclusively focuses on the Taíno before the arrival of Columbus. This is because what we're discussing is what their civilization was like, how it functioned, what their world was like, because this was an entire world that existed and likely would have continued to exist for centuries or millennia, more or less as is, or with certain changes, if it had not been for the arrival of Columbus. And I'd like to try, with the help of our guest, Antonio Curet, try and let the listener in on that world, which we're still trying to piece together with very limited clues. The Taíno did not have, or don't appear to have had, a written language. They did not construct large stone temples. They had permanent housing, but much part of it was hard dirt floors and wood columns. The wood columns could be burnt, and other things could be built on top of the hard dirt floors that they had made. And so it's very difficult to really reconstruct what Taíno life was like. And many history books, especially the ones I read, I study Cuban history, and many of the books on Cuban history either mention them briefly for one, maybe 2 or 3 pages, and then never mention them again, or go into detail about how terrible their life was under the colonization, but don't really explain what life was like before the colonization. It's like they came into being when Columbus arrived, and I think that it's a great opportunity that we have today, an archaeologist, to speak with us about what life was like for them before Columbus arrived.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. This is Andres Pertiera, and today I'm here with Antonio Curet, archaeologist and curator with the Smithsonian's Museum of the American Indian and specialist in the Taíno peoples. Welcome.
Thank you. Welcome.
First, something a little more personal. What is your favorite archaeologist or historian or social scientist?
Oh, wow, that's a hard question. Well, I have to tell you the truth. I became interested in archaeology because in the 1960s, National Geographic had this weekly program, and in one of them they showed Louis and Mary Leakey from Kenya, who were digging an early human Homo habilis site, and they filmed of them excavating and looking for these fossils of early humans, and they're not quite archaeologists because they're looking more at the physical aspect of people, but that caught my attention, like in archaeology, and then looking at people doing field work that really got me into archaeology. Field work and history is archaeology, right? Digging for it and all that, and that actually that's we consider that the first human species because we have found artifacts with it. Mm. So that's it's called the tool maker, because earlier forms of hominids don't show that many artifacts. Although things are changing now. We have that was the 60s. But.
A little before we started recording, you mentioned that you actually studied something before archaeology. I think it was chemistry, was it?
It was chemistry. When I went to college in 1978, yes, I'm old, there was not that much archaeology in Puerto Rico. As far as I know, there were 2 positions for archaeologists, one in the Instituto de Cultura Puertorriqueña and the other one in the university. The university was not filled until the late 80s or mid 80s actually at that position, and by then, it was done. So not that I didn't like archaeology, but I thought, well, to have a future, I want to have a job, So I went with chemistry. I like sciences, so it wasn't. It was a little bit masochism because chemistry is hard, and so it wasn't all, easy. But I like sciences in general, so it wasn't that bad.
Perfect. So today we are going to be discussing in detail the Taíno people with you. The Taíno being the name for a group of peoples that lived in the Greater Antilles, the larger islands in the Caribbean, around the time that Columbus arrived in 1492. First, the Taíno as a name for these people. Is it an appropriate title? Is there something wrong with using this title?
Well, lately some of us have been questioning the use of that title. Actually, the expansion of archaeological expansion of this goes to Bahamas, also Virgin Islands, and we're finding materials that are similar all the way to, not continuous, but in Guadeloupe, close to in Ceiba. We find a site that everything looks very much like what we find in Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic. So it's a huge area, and the problem is that when you look at the materials carefully, you see similarities, probably like today between Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, but you see a lot of differences. And this is using Taíno is almost like saying all Asians or East Asians are Chinese kind of thing. We call them Chinese, and we're hiding a lot of diversities, identities, and for example, Cuba is so huge. Diversity within Cuba is amazing. It's so amazing. It's really hard to group people. And in Dominican Republic, it's big too. Puerto Rico is a little bit easier, but we find differences between regions, and so I think we're doing a disservice to these people. In the past, is saying oh yeah, you all guys were the same, pretty much like the Spanish did when they arrived, right? Being Eurocentric. So, and as a social scientist, that's a big problem because we're giving an identity to people that were different, and when we try to reconstruct past human behavior, we are just using the same mold everywhere, and that's so. On one side, our duty is to represent these people as archaeologists and anthropology, represent these people correctly, ethically, which have to give a voice to these people are not around. And the other one, in terms of studies of social behavior, that we don't go that far because we're so limited by using this term for everybody.
Interesting. And do we know what the Taíno would have called themselves, or?
Let me tell you one small story from the Spanish Chronicles. The word Taíno is mentioned probably 3 or 4 times in the Chronicles, as I said. The Chronicles are the writings by people that wanted to write the history of the conquest, the history of colonization of the encounter between Europeans, and these are not necessarily official documents because official documents also have information, but they mention one where it's mentioned twice of those 4 times is that one of them puts them in Hispaniola, the other person in the Lesser Antilles, but it's the same story. They're confused a little bit. That the Spanish are arriving in an island in a small boat. This is Columbus' second voyage. So they're arriving, and there's Indians on the beach. And when the Indians see them, they say Taíno, Taíno, and the chronicles clearly say Taíno means noble or good, and that's it. That they were describing themselves more or less like, hey, we're good, okay, we're in peace, we come in peace, kind of thing, and then in the 1800s, a German linguist actually misunderstood that as them. They were saying that they were the ethnic group of the Taínos. Instead of describing themselves, he thought that they were saying we belong, I'm Puerto Rican. Yes, I'm Puerto Rican. So so there was some confusion there that was carried on until today.
No, so we don't really know what they would have called themselves, and
Yes, there's no we call it ethnonym, name of an ethnic group.
right.
They call people from Bahamas in Spanish Lucayan because Lucayos was the Bahamas. That's the Indian name, and we know the Indian name of Cuba, but that's the whole island.
Right.
And Haiti was the one for Hispaniola.
Right. And I mean, we don't seem to even really know if they would have understood the category of like Taíno or Spanish as like a cultural thing. Like, it seems like we don't really know if there is a sort of super category they would have used.
Right. No. As far as we know, no. And sometimes they say we're people from this cacique or this chief, like referring that political situation, but they never at the no.
Interesting.
I think they knew they were islanders, right? But that's
commonly in the histories written about Cuba, they talk about three peoples. They talk about the Taíno, the Siboney, and the Guanahátabe. Now, usually historians who talk about the Guanahátabe, who are towards the western end of the island, who, for listeners, that would be the corner that's near the Florida Strait and the Yucatan Strait. But the other 2/3 of the island, which is the center and the east, are usually split up between Taíno and Siboney. Usually the Siboney are kind of referred to as linked to the Taíno. Are they Taíno?
I'm confused as you are, but I know what they refer to Taíno, and you're right. I think that there are sites that can be found with that ceramic that we assign to what we call the Taínos on 2/3 of the island. But you see variability too there. But and I understand that one. When we get to Siboney, it's a little bit confusing because sometimes this used to refer to the archaic people that normally not always supposedly didn't have ceramics. They were used mostly stone tools. Well, we find archaeologically probably they had baskets, they had textiles, they had ropes, they had many other things. And they probably cultivated but relied a lot on hunting and gathering and fishing also. But then when you read the word Siboney, it comes from 1 Chronicle 2. And the author clearly says, oh, this Siboney is very, very similar to the Lucayans from Bahamas.
Oh.
In terms of culture, that's the one that says, and then in Bahamas, when you go there, they were cultivating. The Spanish consider them more or less the same as the other Indians in a way, but they were cultivating. We find ceramics. We find the whole repertoire that we see for later times. Now the problem is that in the Greater Antilles and Bahamas, there's different kinds of ceramic styles, and some of them they're very different. They're not even related in terms of designs and everything. In Cuba, you find that. You find certain groups with one ceramic, what we call in archaeology Meyacan or Meyacoid, and then you have the Chican or Chicoid, and they're completely different. And then some people put both under the same word of Taíno, same name of Taíno. Is this making sense?
Yeah, this makes sense. I mean, it makes sense in the sense that our sources, sometimes very poor amount of sources, our sources don't sound like they themselves fully understood these groups, their identities. So it is a bit confusing, but that's because the information itself is scarce and confusing.
I think part of it you're right, because you see like Columbus Diary, you see a lot of details at first, and it's like they're used to it, they don't even mention things. But I think also is that we tend to simplify the past.
Yeah.
We tend to simplify human relations, and that's one problem that we have in archaeology. In history to a certain point too, but in archaeology more because we are dealing with few artifacts. We probably work with 25% of their material culture. We don't see the straws, we don't see the textiles and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So, and we oversimplify, not to mention that we have a discrimination against non-state level societies. Oh, they're simple because they're not like us. And one problem, I can tell this to my students, when everybody explains some behavior from the past with a simple theory and makes sense, that's a red flag. Don't, look again.
Yeah.
Because I say, imagine your relationship with your boyfriend or girlfriend. How complicated it is, right? We're talking about societies here. If two people is complicated, imagine having these relationships at a bigger scale, even if it's just a village. Yeah. So they weren't as complicated as we are. So we have to be careful with oversimplifying the past.
That sounds like a very good thing to keep in mind, especially for this topic. Now that we've kind of discussed the use of Taíno as a kind of category and all the problems that may come with that, the people that would have been called Taíno, do we know where they originated?
That's a very good question, because if we want to understand that, we have to go to the first humans that came to the islands. Obviously, they didn't evolve there, so they had to migrate from the continent. And what we see, at least two big migrations. Well, let me rephrase that. Two general migrations, because this is not like the Jewish exodus. This might have been like small groups moving. It seems that one came from either Central America, Yucatan area, coming to Cuba, where we have dates are really early, like 3000 before Christ. 4 to 5000 BP, and then and they tend to have like what we call more knives, blades made of flint, a lot of them, but it's a different kind of repertoire than the one we see coming from Trinidad down south. There you see more grinding tools, and then you see in Trinidad we have 5000 BC also. So you see more. Now they don't overlap in time because they're different ends of the archipelago, but more or less they were migrating between 2 and 3000 BC in those areas. But they kind of stay there until later. We see them. The first one moving to Hispaniola, Dominican Republic, Haiti, and then you see from the south people coming to Puerto Rico, for example. And then it seems that they meet in between Puerto Rico and Hispaniola. You can see that there's some exchange of tools are happening. Other people have been arguing there might have been more than those waves, that they might have been also coming from Central America also. Especially when you go to Cuba. Cuba, again, is huge. It's so complicated. You see sites that are pure with the cutting blades and all that stuff. But then you see other sites that don't have that, but they have early dates, So they might have been more than two waves, especially in Cuba. And but the problem is that once people settle one place, they start changing, and their tools change because of the environment. They were the first Cubans in that case, and I have to be careful because Cuban is a nation now.
Right.
They didn't know what a nation is.
Right.
But it seems that because it's so old. And because sometimes they're really deep deposits, it's really hard to study these because we're just seeing like a snapshot of their culture. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes things don't preserve that well that long. Right,
but that definitely is surprising me. So they knew metallurgy. They knew how to.
No. These are flint.
Flint weapons.
Stone tools.
Stone tools.
Yeah,
okay.
Sorry. Yeah, no, this is stone tools.
And you say that one of these groups came up from the Lesser Antilles through Trinidad, and the other group came through possibly Central America.
Well, there's still discussion. Most people think that they migrated from Yucatan, but some people say, well, there's some similar stone tools from Central America to Yucatan. Depending where you see where Central America and where North America ends.
Right.
Yucatan can be considered Central America at a certain point, but so it depends on who you talk to. But there's some tools from Belize are that early, and this is at least there's some discussion if there were Mayas or not in terms of language. It's before the pyramids and all that stuff of the Mayas there. But other people think that they might have migrated across the Caribbean Sea because the sea level was lower and there were some small islands that they could have hopped. The problem is that we haven't found any of these kind of tools in Jamaica, which would be the obvious stopover. But Jamaica doesn't have that much archaeological work. I think they should have found it by now. And then from there, eventually, towards the more or less, depending if we don't count Trinidad because it's close to Venezuela, people start moving into the islands later on around 500 BC, and these were people that had ceramics. The first people were doing cultivation definitely, but they were hunting and gathering, moving around. But these people had villages and ceramics. They cultivated. We assume that was slash and burn, cutting trees, burning them, and then planting there, because the ashes are kind of a fertilizer. And they navigated. Well, everybody had to navigate to get to but it seems that they came from South America. These first people with ceramics. There's some early ceramics before that, but nothing like this one. This is different. Painted pottery, beautiful pottery. Normally people think that they pushed the early ones, that they pushed what we call the archaics, the older sculptures. But I think what happened was what always happens when people encounter each other. In this case, they didn't fight, which is one of the options, but I think they actually started interacting and they exchanged. And I think the process of creolization began to happen, and something that we think in the Caribbean, what we call creolization, referring to the mixes of races and cultures, we think about the Africans, but I think that started between native groups. It started happening at that time, and you see local cultural developments. In the ceramics, you see it. There's certain objects that develop now that if you see it anywhere in the world, comes from the Caribbean. It's local only, like the 3-pointers. They're kind of
3-pointers?
They're kind of idols that are kind of they're in general they're like triangles, but it's not like it's not necessarily it's triangular in a way, but not completely. It might curve. Two of the sides going up might curve.
Yeah, so it's like an unequal triangle with two ends being kind of the same, but the top end being longer or something.
Right. And then sometimes it's almost like an island where you get to the coastal plain and then go up to the mountain on both sides.
Interesting.
Is that you get it?
Yeah.
It's hard to explain without showing a picture.
I'm sure we can find for the when we publish it, we can find some photos.
Oh yeah. In our collections, I found one from Venezuela.
Interesting.
And I can bet my life that it came from the Greater Antilles, because you find it only in the style. That style is Greater Antilles, and I'll dare to say that I think it's from Puerto Rico, but it was found in Venezuela. But normally I don't find it outside the Caribbean. And also there's these stone collars. They're almost like there's like about
stone
1.5
columns
feet made of stone.
Yeah.
They're not completely circular, so they're a little bit oval. There's some that are massive, that are thick. And then the other ones are slender. We call them slender. There's finer and better down with some designs. They carve some design on the rock, and that's Caribbean alone. And I think this developed because of these. It comes from ideas from both the archaic, the early people, and the later people that mix and started developing these subjects that for sure they have some religious significance. And the stone colors might have also be related with status, because not everybody had one of those. And from all this, I think these people we call Taínos evolved from this mixing. Interaction kept going also during this time. It kept interacting with at least South America. Some people are going with Central America too. So
interesting. So this definitely goes against some of the versions of this that I had read in some of the older texts, which basically talk about the Taínos, one being just kind of a culture that came out of South America, but they don't really talk about it mixing with other Caribbean cultures or earlier migration waves. So that's definitely interesting. And this exchange, this continued exchange with South America, that's definitely different. Is this when did this kind of change in how we understand the period happen?
That's a good question. One thing that happened is that for the longest time, everything we saw early, or archaeologists in the early time, where the connection with South America is not until, for example, in terms of the archaic, the early people, it's not until the 70s, I believe, that the Cuban archaeologists start finding those huge flint stone blades. They're huge, and I was like, what's that kind of artifact? There's no big animals in Cuba. They used to have a sloth.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if they used it to kill it, because we don't find that many skeletons of sloth. We find it, but not that many. But anyway, they're very characteristics of this period. That's not in South America. That's South American stuff was coming with grinding tools, not that much cutting tools, but nothing specialized like those beautiful blades, And then when that shows up, it's like, okay, we have more people here. We start thinking Florida. But then Florida doesn't have anything like that, so now they're looking into Yucatan and Central America, and it's a high possibility. It has high possibility that. And later on, since these groups came, were established in Cuba, we're seeing that these ceramic people were not just pushing these archaics or killing them or whatever, or absorbing them in their culture, but it seems now that there was interaction. There was again people exchanging spouses, or exchanging materials, and in Cuba, for example, people start finding blades in some sites where you don't see evidence of blade production, and so they trade in the blades. They're not making them in the site. There's no evidence of it, but that means, and then the rest of the assemblage is different than where in the other sites with blades. So people are exchanging locally, and the connection with South America probably was there all this time too. At least in the Lesser Antilles and Puerto Rico, we don't know if it's down the line or direct or both. That's right. Is this making sense?
Yeah, this makes sense.
Am I answering your question?
Yeah, it is. And my next big question is, so we've now brought the Taíno people we've heard about how they came, the Taíno people came about, how they are this mix of these different migration waves. It's created something new, not just evolved on their own, but this new creation out of this cultural exchange. What would Taíno society, at least in the Greater Antilles, what would it have been like?
That's another great question. And this is one of the problems of using the word Taíno, and this is I'm guilty of this too. Okay, that we say Taíno. Well, most of the chronicles, a lot of the information we have comes from the chronicles because they saw the living people, they saw them working, they saw them with the wood and the textiles and everything, and it came mostly from Hispaniola, from Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, Haiti. And then we start applying that for the rest of the Caribbean. And then since they had chiefdoms, what we call chiefdom, which is a stratified society, they don't have a government, like it's not a state-level society, but there's inherited positions of power and authority. We tend to think that all the Taínos had chiefdoms. And this is the problem, is that when you start scratching under the surface, you see that even in places where the Spanish were saying there were big caciques, that's the word for chief in Arawak, which was the language of the Indians from the Caribbean. It's like, I'm working in a ceremonial center, early ceremonial center in Puerto Rico, and there's ball courts and plaza, not like the Mayas, but there's still ball courts and plazas, and it's a ceremonial center. This smells like stratification here. Well, I haven't found anything that would point to stratification. Actually, I dare to say I can find more fancy stuff, or goodies as I call them, in other sites in Puerto Rico than in this ceremonial center, which is almost unique in the Caribbean. At early time, more or less between, as a ceremonial center, like between 1000 and 1200 AD, way before Spanish. And so it's like, wait a minute, so where's the chief? How come we don't see high status objects here, or maybe some areas of the site with more fancy stuff than others, or better food? We're not finding that, and we haven't found the tomb. In Puerto Rico has been excavated a lot. We haven't found a tomb and said, yeah, there's the chief. After all the excavations we had done in Puerto Rico, so maybe there's something else here, not just this chiefdom as we see them, but a different kind of chiefdom, or different social organizations.
Interesting. I think I've heard something kind of maybe like the precursor to what you're talking about in terms of how we theorize about this stuff. I think it was in Irving Rouse, who wrote a book on the Taínos. I think he referred it to like Taíno 1 and Taíno 2 or something. Different levels of complexity in different regions.
Yes, he talks about sub-Taínos, I think, at
one
something,
point.
So
yeah. Something
Taíno,
like that.
Or in Puerto Rico that we used to call them pre-Taíno, which for me that's the Creolicide culture. After the people from South America came and started mixing, they start creating a new culture that is not the one that the Europeans found. There's this culture that we call Ostiones in general, and then comes the Taíno later. Okay, so there's four cultures in general in the traditional view. The Archaico were the early ones with stone tools mostly. The ceramic people with more agriculture than before, but and then we have like local development, and then that changes into what we see and call Taíno nowadays in the islands.
Right.
And there's that culture, and they call it sub-Taíno because it's not quite Taíno. It's a little bit evolutionary because they're not haven't evolved completely. Puerto Rico we say pre-Taíno because it was before the Taíno, but So that they have those categories. Siboney will be the Subtaíno under that perspective.
Under that perspective.
And we have to be careful because I think Siboney has been used with different meanings. Sometimes referring to the only stone tool people, but then sometimes they find ceramics.
Yeah.
And I think many Cubans are not using that word anymore, archaeologists in general, but it is so complicated, it's really that hard to categorize.
I understand. So what would, let's take, for example, a typical site in Puerto Rico. What would a typical site be or population center be for the Taíno?
Oh, in general, Puerto Ricans, and I haven't studied, Puerto Rican sites in general are small.
Okay.
Compared to South American ones where you have these huge sites, and even for non-stratified societies, they find big sites, and we have big sites with our standards, but they're not like other. And the Lesser Antilles is more or less the same. There might be some big, but that's not the rule. It tends to be. There have been few cases where they have found the post holes of the houses. The houses were made of tree trunks for the beams and the columns, and then a lot of straw and rope made of some kind of fibers.
Straw, like
a palm frond. Leaves and
palm leaves.
Well, not quite straw. You're right. But there's certain palms that probably they use. It's not hay.
But I mean, it certainly wasn't a teepee. It was a larger structure with strong wooden columns. And
might be larger than a teepee. Yes, exactly. But not too much. Depending which period. Yes. Some houses are 8 meter in diameters or less, 6 to 8 meters. That's between 20 to 25 feet. So that's even smaller than a bedroom sometimes in a.
Yeah.
I mean, not necessarily, but a master bedroom.
Yeah.
It's interesting. The few houses we have found for the first ceramic people that I mentioned. Again, they had ceramic before in the Caribbean, but this came with beautiful ceramic. Those people tend to have bigger houses, like multi-family houses. And then later on, in at least in the Greater Antilles and what we have seen in the Lesser Antilles too, we start finding when Europeans arrive, they're smaller houses. They're 6 to 8 meters in diameter, and they tend to be round. But archaeologically, it's difficult to study because that doesn't preserve. So we can find three things. One is a hardened dirt floor, which is if you find it, sometimes it's so hard that it's really hard to break through it actually. The problem is that because of trees, bugs, and everything, the Caribbean being in general, not all the Caribbean is tropical, the roots and everything soften the soil, so sometimes it's hard to detect archaeologically. The other one is the post holes or post molds. It could be actually some of them might have the charcoal of the wood, from the post, or sometimes we find trash, meaning that they remove the post and they put trash in there, So, but we can find the post holes. Sometimes it depends on the soil, the color of the differences. If it's too dark, it's really hard to see the post. But if it's like sandy color, it's easier because you see darker soil inside the hole. And the third thing is if they burn the house.
Right.
And then you're finding, there's a fourth one actually, and it's unique site in Cuba, Buchillones. It's in northern Cuba. North Central. I don't remember exact province.
Near which city? Camagüey or?
I think it's so hard to get to it. It's away from any central city, but I don't have the information now.
Central Cuba.
But the site was on a beach.
Okay.
But it's subsumed, meaning that the surface of the beach, because of tectonic earthquakes and tectonic movement, dropped. So where the village was now before, part of it is on the water, part of it is still on the beach, but it's the modern beach. And they've been finding actual posts. Sometimes just the bottom part of it, but sometimes like when these houses collapse, they can find the beams and parts of the columns. They find wooden spoons, dishes, idols, seats. They found so much. I think they found some fibers and textile too. I think, but small pieces of those. yeah, they were able to find tons of stuff that we normally don't find.
Wow.
And they've been trying to figure out the shapes of the houses. Again, they look to be circular, although there's one that looks rectangular there too. So it seems that there were more than just.
And you mentioned that spoons. So like they had spoons or forks.
Oh yes,
knives?
yes. Now we see spoons made of shells too. Sometimes archaeologically. Also, we find if you take the conch, some conchs you cut and you can create like a bowl out of conchs too. You know, spoon shells. I mean spoons, bowls, scrapers with shell too. They have different.
And this would have been common for people to have, or would this be like a status symbol to have those?
We find that many that enough to say that that's probably common. And actually, what we find a lot too is what we call them shell axes. Using if you have the queen conch of the Caribbean, what they call the wing of it, they make axes. We call them axes, but I suspect they're like for hoes or for digging sticks, because shell is hard, but I don't think it's hard enough to cut a tree.
Right.
I think it's going to break eventually. So, but that's. I mean, nobody has experimented on this to see what's the function of that. And
you mentioned it might be used for agriculture. When I studied as an undergraduate, usually they talked about things like just basically burnt sticks, and you'd stick this burnt stick in the ground, right, and that'll open a hole, and you throw the seeds in. But this is actually talking about something that seems like a much more familiar European, or old world rather, agricultural tool. It's a kind of a blade which helps them cut the earth. Yeah. And
actually, I mentioned that can be hoes, but they're not that wide. It might be the point of the digging stick too. So you know, it could be it seems that things are more sophisticated because our knowledge of a lot of these things was based on the chronicles alone, because people weren't that creative yet, or techniques weren't developed in archaeology. They said digging sticks were hardened, had hardened points by burning them a little bit, and you're right, but I think they were more sophisticated than that.
And when you mentioned textiles, what kind of textile, like what was the fabric made out of?
The chronicles mentions mostly cotton. And I actually some of Columbus in Cuba, some of Columbus men that went, he sent to explore a little bit. They came back and they mentioned about, among other things, bohío, which is the name that they have for the Indian name for hut, for house or building, yeah. And they said there was one full of bundles of cotton, but normally they went naked. Cotton was used, at least in personal use, was only married women, supposedly, according to the Spanish, with kind of it's a loincloth, but only covering the front, you know. And they used some bands around their arms, upper arms, and bottom legs, calf area, and very tight. And you see a lot of the drawings of the period. And actually, you see it among some Indians from South America using that. Cotton was used sometimes for headdresses with feathers, but hammocks too.
And hammocks.
Hammocks, that's a biggie. There's a possibility, and I cannot remember if anybody has found this yet archaeologically. Maguey, or what is called yucca. It's a cactus. It's called maguey, yucca, and there's another name. It's not yucca. Yucca is manioc.
Tunas? No,
tunas are the flat ones. These are the ones that are long leaves with a thorn in the point that they make tequila and what's the other?
Yes.
They make ropes. Actually, Henneken. It comes from maguey. Century plant is another name in English.
Okay.
It's century plant, yucca, Y-U-C-C-A, or maguey, which is the Taíno word, if you will.
Right.
Maguey, M-A-G-U-E-Y.
Okay.
And we know that this used all over the Americas for fiber too. So I'm trying to remember if it's mentioned in the chronicles, but I cannot remember, and I'm very, very, very careful now every time I say something, because I might be. I want to be more accurate than just creating another myth.
Yeah.
Going around.
But that's interesting. So they had these homes that had these like the fact that they had these central beams suggests that they were rather permanent structures.
Oh yes.
Yeah, and they have these textiles. They are obviously used in order to grow the cotton. They obviously have agricultural techniques. What would they normally eat?
There's many products that we find in the chronicles, but we're finding more also on archaeologically now with different techniques. The chronicles, the standard diet included fish. Being an island, it's expected, and there are different kinds of fish that they ate. There were different type of small animals in the islands. Islands in general tend to have small animals all over the world, and with few exceptions like the Dominican and Cuban sloth, who died really quick after humans came into the island. They became extinct. But there's a lot of rodents, and when I say rodents, it's not rats necessarily. They were talking like rabbit or hare type size of rodents. Like rabbits are rodents too, and squirrels, right?
Right.
But these are more or less, maybe sometimes a little bit bigger than that, that they call with this generic term hutia. That was in the islands, and we find that archaeologically, and they moved them from island to island. Puerto Rico didn't have that many, and suddenly archaeologically we see the Dominican hutia showing up there, and it seems that they were tendering them, not only hunting them, but also probably kept them in captivity and maybe reproduce there too, like rabbits, right?
Right.
In terms of botanical food, manioc, which is a tuber, is a root that is common all over the Americas, mostly in the tropics. But I think it was found in or yuca. That's the name that we tend to use in daily language. But it was found in Florida, I think, and the Mayas ate it a lot too. And it's not mentioned that much by archaeologists from Mexico. They talk more about the corn, right?
Yeah.
But it's used everywhere, and it's good because actually it's on the ground, survives hurricanes. It's good food, and also once you make a bread, depending on variety you use, it stays, and you keep it dry, it stays good for months, and people say over a year sometimes. Some of these Spanish chronicles say Spanish loved it because before going back to Spain, they will fill their ships with that. Because when I read Columbus' diary, when he left Spain, on the Canary Islands, within 4 days, the water was brown, and there were things swimming in it already. The flour and the bread was already moldy, and also things growing there, really quick, and they didn't have refrigeration or anything. So when they have this bread that will stay good for a year, if you keep it dry, they love that bread, they like it. Other things that they ate, fruits, many kind. Corn, of course, maize. Actually, the word maize or maíz in Spanish is from the Caribbean. It's not Aztec. It's not Mesoamerican.
Really?
Maize is maize, tobacco, hurricane. There's many words in standard Spanish that is maní for peanuts. They're in English too. Tobacco.
Right.
They come because that's the first time Europeans saw it. The Caribbean was the first part that was colonized. So they're getting all this news about this great grain that they call maíz. And eventually they call them Indian corn because corn is not for maize. In Europe, it's used for grains in general.
Right.
Anyway, fruit, papaya, zapote, which I don't know how to translate that in English, but there's different kind of guayaba or guava in English.
Guava.
Yeah, there's so many things. We find archaeologically not that much the fruit themselves, but the starch grain that they leave behind. Sometimes pollen. Sometimes we see them carbonized, and that's what we can find. So.
And going back to cassave, which would be the yuca bread, right? How would a Taíno have prepared this bread? Do we know?
Yep. There are different varieties, and the varieties that all over the Americas that they tended to like more was the one that was poisonous. There's some varieties that are not poisonous. They probably have a little bit of a poison, but they like the poisonous one. And the process is probably they use it for all type of yuca. Involve peeling the root and then grating it, and it created like a pulp. Was mushy and wet, and they will put this in a very long basket. This pulp, a long basket that will be hanging from a branch or from a roof or somewhere. Fill it up. It's almost, think about Chinese finger traps. Those cylindrical. Yeah, piece of basket, but make this big, and probably like I would say like 8 inches in diameter, or 8 to 10, and then no, actually 10 would be 8. Fill it with this pulp, and then they start pulling it from the bottom. Normally it's with a lever, with a stick that has a lever, or and somebody sits on the stick, and the way there until it starts squishing. It stretches the basket, and the basket starts squishing and removing all the liquid. Is this making sense?
Yeah, that's making sense.
The liquid, in many cases, in many societies, they leave it outside, and it becomes kind of vinegary, and I guess it ferments a little bit, and that takes care of the poison. So they use it as an ingredient for some recipes too.
But would the poison remain in the liquid?
I should skip a step. Yeah, the poison is in the liquid.
Okay, but
Okay.
but then they would use it as an ingredient in other things.
Well, but they let it age outside. It becomes vinegar,
Okay.
kind of a vinegar, and then the poison is neutralized at that point.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not.
Yeah, the active.
I'm getting excited here.
The active ingredient would just kind of like once whatever chemical process happens when it ferments.
Right.
The active ingredient or poisonous ingredient would just degrade.
Right. Exactly. So the liquid eventually can be used for that, and
Right.
then actually they squeeze that so much that when it comes out, it's almost like flour.
Huh.
They pulp it because it's flour, so they dry it pretty good, and then it's pure starch. It's pure starch. They put over a griddle on a fire, and since the starch is sugar, so it's not sweet, but it's starchy. It starts melting kind of a little bit, and binding each grain with each other, and then the bread comes out. So it's not. It doesn't mix it with. You don't have to knead it. Let's
Right.
put it that way.
And so it would definitely be a flat bread, right? It would
It
not.
is
Yeah.
normally circular, most of the times.
Yeah.
They're circular, flat bread. That's right.
Yeah.
Sometimes I've seen like 1.5 inches thick, depending on
Yeah.
what part of the world you're in.
And in Cuba, it's actually pretty thin, from what at least
really?
what in
Like tortillas?
Yeah, in the eastern provinces, it's like somewhere between a tortilla and a pancake.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's pretty thin usually.
Yeah, it is.
But
I seen it like an inch, but I have to double check.
I mean, is it thicker in Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic?
Puerto Rico, it was very popular when I was little, but not anymore. You don't see it that much, and maybe there's some towns along the coast that still make it, but Dominican Republic, oh yes, Haiti. I don't know that much of Haiti, but probably they do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know in Cuba actually, but in Dominican Republic, our colleague Jorge Esteves, there's towns that specialize on making cassave to sell in the market actually.
When I was in Cuba, my experience is that in the western provinces, especially in the capital, it's not really that common anymore. I mean, you can get it, but it's just not that omnipresent. But in the eastern provinces, especially provinces like Holguín, which is, for listeners, that's a little bit to the north of Santiago de Cuba, there it's everywhere. You always have to have, especially for the end of the year, the big feast where they kill the pig, you always have to have your cassava.
Really? That's right. Wow.
And blood sausage. Cassava and blood sausage.
Of course, we have that in Puerto Rico. That's not indigenous.
So interesting. So we have this image of the Taíno, which is definitely different from the media version, which would probably be just a bunch of people with sticks and maybe some very temporary huts along the beach, which is like the terrible movies about Columbus.
Right. No, and actually, to be honest, that's the view that many of my colleagues and I had too. Because we weren't looking for this. We thought that what we learned before was true. So we assumed things, and then we got in trouble, right? Because we're not looking at the reality of these people.
Right. And so that's the way in which misconceptions that date back to the early modern period and then are popularized through the media hurt even, scholarly attempts, because you have to unlearn everything that you thought you knew.
Yeah, at one point, and I've been trying to deal with this, not directly in Puerto Rico, how can we show people... one problem about this is that I have is that view dehumanizes the Indians from the past, or indigenous people. Not that they dehumanize us like we use that word now, like dehumanize, but in a word that they're now humans like us.
Mm-hmm.
or it's almost modern centric too, because they're not as advanced as us. And you look at the religion of these people were thinking philosophically and symbolically very complex thoughts, but we don't have that idea. And then how can I change that view among my colleagues, but also the popular or people in general in Puerto Rico? Is really hard. So my solution is we cannot do anything with the older people. Let's start with the kids, showing them like a more not perfect, but more realistic view of the past, because it's really hard to change people's minds, like you say, once they learn it.
Yeah. And speaking of that, how did they see the world? How did they see themselves, or what is their philosophical or religious or cultural?
That's another good question. It's
I imagine that it's kind of hard to summarize in a few words.
And the people that deal with it, there's some couple of people in the Caribbean that are genius on this. They're really good at, we call this area of study semiotics. They're dealing with symbols and all this, because we have are small pieces of this big, huge jigsaw puzzle of how they saw their world, and they extrapolate from that. And sometimes like, what were they smoking when they thought about this, right? Because it's like, and that's many times they're right, which is good. But it's really hard. And they definitely knew, if you look in our physical world, they clearly knew about the other islands, each island they knew. And according to some of the chronicles, Columbus kidnapped a couple of Indians, I think it was in Bahamas, to serve them as guides, where to go and things, and also for communicating. And it seems that they knew where the islands were. And, if I go to Puerto Rico, well, nowadays we travel a lot, but I bet like in the 50s or 60s or 40s, many Puerto Ricans haven't traveled outside the island. It's like, but they seems that somehow those people got that knowledge growing up in the island, even though if they were from the mountains. Mm-hmm. So they knew about the ocean, about the ocean, of course, but the other islands and the people, and probably because people were going back and forth. There's strong evidence that there were people related from Dominican Republic and Western Puerto Rico. So they were aware of their physical world, which is amazing, because they were using canoes, It's not like, and they don't have internet or podcasts like this one. But then they mix. For many societies, the spiritual and the physical world are one. The physical world is part of that physical or spiritual world, and it seems that they for example, one debate that is in the Caribbean is who in the world are the Caribs, the famous cannibals, and the first time that they hear this is, I believe, is in Bahamas. When the first encounter was in Bahamas between Columbus and the Indians, first voyage, and they say, oh yeah, the Caribs are towards the east, and they come and attack us and all this stuff, and we don't know exactly what that word meant for them. Did it mean the people from the Lesser Antilles, as the Spanish thought later on, or do they mean the spirits from the east? Or do they mean Carib is any people that came to raid us? Or, it's a term like Vandals, or that
right.
It was a ethnic group, but then it became Vandals is the word that is used for anybody that comes to, to attack us or whatever, or barbarians, if you will. So we don't know exactly, because, again, it could have been 2 or 3 of those options, who knows? Because, it seems that they divided their general world also with the spiritual world, the physical world, and they believe, for example, what they called semis, like the 3-pointer that I mentioned before, the triangular. We thought that they were idols in a sense. Oh yeah, they're representations of a god, and no, for them these are individuals. These are they're. It's not that they're possessed with the spirit; it's that the stone and the spirit are one. And it's a little bit for us. It's hard to visualize this. And since they're not individuals, they're persons, not human persons, but they have personality, and the relationship between the owner and the idol, which is not idol, but the idol affected a lot of how things turn out. It's very complicated. That's what I mentioned before. They have a complicated cosmology or cosmovision, where this stone actually can talk. And it's not that it's possessed, it's that it's stone and it has a spirit. It's a spirit, spiritual too. And that's why there's some semis are more powerful than other. And if you're a powerful chief and you have a good relationship with a powerful semi, that's the perfect combination, because you have to offer things to the semi. You have a relationship with them. Is this making sense?
No, that makes sense. It's religion as a kind of philosophical system. It's a way to understand the world. These aren't magical and physical elements separated. It's the magic is the
There's
world.
no dichotomy there. Exactly. So we live in the spiritual world too.
Right.
It's both. You're right. That you got it. That's the important thing.
Interesting. And when let's get to kind of the more unfortunate side of the story of the Taínos, which is the conquest of the Spanish by the Spanish. What was the impact of Columbus on, at least focusing on the Greater Antilles? What is the impact of the first 20 or so years of conquest on these different peoples that we call the Taíno?
I mean, obviously, it wasn't a good thing for these Indians. Definitely. I mean, they came, they took, and they conquered if they opposed it. And here I'm going to make a parenthesis because it's something that I'm finding more and more. There's everybody when I talk about the Spanish coming to the Americas, they're brutal, they killed, and and it's true, but not worse than any other empire. No worse than the Aztecs, no worse than the Incas. It's not worse than the British, actually, empire. Empires are brutal by definition because they have to conquer. And sometimes just the threat will conquer the place. That's how much fear people had. And the Spanish, again, they did brutalities. The only thing is that there's something that's called in academia the black legend, leyenda negra.
Yeah, of the Spanish.
That when the Spanish started doing a lot of this, not all Spanish were bad. Not all priests killed Indians that didn't convert. And actually that was rare, actually. But what happened is that one particular defender of the Indians wrote a report to the king, Bartolomé de las Casas, and he. Many scholars think he exaggerated a little bit, but brutalities were happening. We're not denying that in any sense. Brutalities were happening. It's a report. It's very vivid. It talks about thousands of Indians being killed, and all that stuff. This is when Henry VIII starts breaking away from the church, and when you put church and politics together, this Catholic Church, Spain, and who's the big guy there at that time? The big is Spain. They started translating that report everywhere. The Dutch took it too because the Spanish were there, and it became to be a general thing that wherever the Spanish went, brutalities like that happened. Some of them we think are exaggerated, other ones are true. It's like but again, not worse than the British in North America or in India. If you talk to people from India, the country, ask them what the British did there. That's the nature of empires. And so we have to be careful and this happened in academia. I see my colleagues saying, "Oh yeah, the Spanish was there," and everything went downhill right away. And they have this vision of brutality, killing, and all that stuff right away. And we have to be careful because there were people like us. That now we're dehumanizing another type of people by generalizing, and that's another problem. I'm not defending the Spanish. I mean, the Spanish again were brutal. But not worse than anybody else, any other empire. They came, they took land, they started, not right away, but they started, and it's very interesting. Columbus is the first one that took some of them as slaves and sent it to Spain because they weren't finding enough treasures for economic reasons to be sold in Spain. When they arrived there, and the Queen Isabella said, so that he put a stop on it. She yelled at him, these Indians are my subjects, and you treat them, they're not slaves. And she stopped the slavery, at least a slave. Eventually the crown creates this program or plan of calling encomiendas, that the Indians can work in the Spanish haciendas or mines, and but the Spanish had to provide food, clothing, and teaching the Catholic, the Christian religion. That was like, for them was a good trade between both places, and there were brutalities there too. There are many reasons why if you think about it, the Spanish wouldn't like to mistreat the Indians because that's their labor. They're going to be weakened. They're not going to work hard. They don't have. So they want to keep them because that's their labor. There weren't black slaves around yet. But there were abuses definitely with the Indians, and also any Indian that rebelled, they went full force against them, definitely.
Right.
And but on top of that, abuses, warfare, diseases. And we're finding out that we know that Indians were in all the Americas. They did not have resistance to many European diseases, and and many of them died. I mean, whole villages died all over the Americas from all this. And it seemed that diseases was a big killer there. Spanish killed, abuses too. But the one that could eliminate one village in one shot is chickenpox, for example. Something like a kid's disease. They wouldn't have resistance to it. And so all this, some of them, why did the Spanish thought, and then later on European countries thought that they can come here and this is my land now. It's hard to understand why. I know the Spanish were pushing away pushing out the Muslim from the peninsula, but why come here and think that they can say that? I don't know where that came from. And other countries, wasn't only Spain. They started kind of taking Indians' land. In the case of the Caribbean, Indian labor, that's the only thing they wanted the Indians for. There were some people that were very worried about the Indians too, as this friar, Bartolomé de las Casas. Interesting enough, a colleague from Cuba excavated an encomienda cemetery. It's like a colono or a Spanish hacienda where they bury the people, and he's finding out that the men show hard work, hard labor, but none of them are malnourished. In terms, at least there's no evidence that they. It seems that they were eating less meat, but they look like they were eating. They see evidence that they were carrying heavy stuff and whatever, but that's like a construction worker will show evidence of like similar type of marks in the body because they're working. So, but it doesn't seem. There's one case of broken arm, like there was defensive wound. Only one of I don't know 20 or 30 individuals, but we don't know exactly what happened. But nobody has broken bones like from besides that person. And they mentioned another case from Florida that also doesn't show that much about abuses. I mean, they're still. I'm saying they weren't free. They're still so they weren't free. They were there, and actually there was probably a Mesoamerican Indian buried there, not from the Cuba. So it's a mix, and this is a very complex problem that we tend to say, oh, the Spanish killed the Indians. They did brutalities like taking their lands and the religion and everything. There's no doubt about it. But sometimes people exaggerate.
But like one thing that one of our guests actually mentioned that I found interesting was that we back in the day we had the black legend, the Spaniards, we still have it, where the reports like Bartolomé de las Casas is a brief history of the destruction of the Indies, which he wrote in the 1540s, 1530s, something like that. That was then weaponized by other European states which didn't particularly care about the indigenous people but wanted to use it as an excuse to legitimize their own conquest of the Americas because they portrayed themselves as the lesser of two evils. That's definitely true. Then in the 20th century we have the I think the virgin soil hypothesis is what it's often called, about how they didn't have contact with the they didn't have immunity against disease, so that's what killed most of them off. Yeah. One of the guests recently actually said that his problem with the virgin soil hypothesis is that even if we suppose 95% mortality rates, they would have eventually been able to bounce back if not for European colonial intervention. So, like, what do you think at least in the Greater Antilles, what do you think that this encomienda system and all the rest impacted and limited them from being able to bounce back?
That's a good point, because the colonial situation, perpetuated that reduction in population and everything. they didn't get out of it because they were in a bad colonial situation. Definitely, I understand, and that's a good point. Actually, and I agree. I mean, the Indians, even today, in many parts of Latin America, if you call somebody Indio, it's offensive. You're insulting that person. Use that word to offend somebody, not to refer to anything. So that I think is a reflection of how even at that time they were looking. It's an old way of thinking. So the Indians were always like in the bottom of the social order in a way, and many of them didn't have. Well, depends, because you see, I was reading this article by a colleague on Eastern Cuba. Some of them had in the communities, they formed their own communities many times, and actually when they were free, they had this community, and somewhere like Cuba, so huge, not that they detached completely from the Spanish society, because they still wanted metal stuff, and they want to exchange things, but they some of them owned land, maybe not like the Spanish big piece of land, but it seems that they were. Cuba is different than Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is different than the Dominican Republic, and we have to be careful when we talk about these generalizations. And I think you're right that Indians had. First of all, they were so little, and they started mixing with other people too in some places. But it's true in Latin America, even after the independence in the countries in general, the Indians are in the lower Mexico. Yeah. You have one side, they talk about the Aztecs or ancestors or whatever, but then to the Indian that's next to them, what did they say? Can I use a dirty word here? Yeah. Pinche India, they call them. They would call them. And I mean, for me, that's not a... But, so you still see it today in these countries. And definitely, malnutrition, bad diseases and so on, because they don't have medical help or all that has not allowed Indian populations to bounce back. Bounce back, thank you.
Yeah. No, out of curiosity, do we have an estimate for what the Taíno population of the Greater Antilles was before the conquest as opposed to after?
There's several, even Bartolomé Las Casas, I think he said there were like for for Hispaniola, I think more than 1 million Indians, I think. And there's several scholars that have been trying to put numbers together, but to be honest, a lot of it is, there's a lot of speculation. One way I did it for one valley, for example, for one study that I did in southeastern Puerto Rico in the valley of Mount Nabo, was finding sites, measuring how big they are, and comparing with sites from modern Indians in South America, estimate how many people live there, and that was statistically used, but that's one valley. Some other valleys might be more populated or less. Right. I don't know how representative this valley is, but the chronicles talk about a lot of Indians, and we find tons of sites of late period too, so I don't want to say overpopulated, but it wasn't like vacant islands, in general.
Do we have like an approximate? Like I've heard for the island of Cuba, around 100,000 being thrown around.
Yes, I think for Puerto Rico they have 100,000 to 1 million or something, and then for again, this is
these are
speculation. I think to be honest, I might be mixing those two, but for Hispaniola, I think Bartolomé Las Casas had a high number, and 100,000 for Hispaniola is too small, and being from Puerto Rico, I see Hispaniola and Cuba, they're huge. For me, it's like, you can fit like 20 million there if you want to, because they're so big compared to us, so I have to be careful. But actually, if they think Puerto Rico has only 4 million, less than 4 million people now, and for me, it's so speculative that I don't remember, to be honest, the actual numbers and this big range, but I don't.
So, a lot of I can't speak for Dominican Republic, but in terms of how the Taíno are taught in Cuba, it's often taught that they basically just disappeared. In fact, most of the history books that I read maybe mention them in the 17th and 18th centuries when it has to do with pirate attacks or something, like the nearby Indians of Guanabacoa were called to fight against the blah, blah. But I mean, they basically disappear after the 18th century for most histories.
In the case of Cuba, late 18th century. 1800s.
So, did the Taínos survive in any form, in any of the Greater Antilles?
I can speak better at Puerto Rico because I studied this recently, and I mean I'm not a specialist on this, but I have consulted documents and also colleagues' work. In Cuba, I have read things recently. In Puerto Rico, document after document, even from the late 1500s, saying we have some Indians here, reports to the king, but none of them they're not from the original ones. Some people claim that some what we call Taínos might have survived in the mountains, in communities. Some people claim that there were communities that survived for a long period of time in the mountains. And Puerto Rico is so little, if they have to burn a field to start planting, or even to make ceramics, or even cook, you can see the smoke from far away.
Mm-hmm.
So they couldn't be hiding completely. And the Spanish knew the trails.
Right.
There were trails, and they actually there were some rebellions in Puerto Rico, and after the rebellions, the Spanish went to the mountains to start catching, and to the villages, and they knew where they were. And sure, them have been in caves and so on, but the population might have been pretty small in Puerto Rico. Cuba and Dominican Republic, well, Enriquillo, which was a mestizo that rebelled, he considered himself Indian. It was like the Jerónimo of the Caribbean, was never defeated. The Spanish had to have a treaty with him, with Enriquillo.
When would this have been?
This was
16th
like
century?
in the 1500s.
In the 1500s?
Yeah, 15th century would be 16, you said, or 15?
Oh, so 1500s, which would be the 16th century.
Yeah.
Are we talking second half or first half? First half, right?
To be honest, he probably is middle to. I think it's around the middle, but I'll have to check that.
No.
Actually, I'm sorry, I'm not good with
worries.
dates. An archaeologist is not good with dates.
You
it's not BC.
Yeah, you measure history in millennia, not.
Right. No, he went to the. I think it's the Lake of Gonaf. Is it called now? Or it's actually there's a lake with this name, Lake Enriquillo, in southeastern Hispaniola or Haiti. It's in that area between Hispaniola. That was the area where he hid, and they were very good at. There was a community. I mean, he had and even escaped slaves joined him, and the community, and they were careful with fires, so not to show the.
Mm-hmm.
But they were also up in the mountains, really high, and a couple of times they tried to get to them, and the Spanish were defeated, and they will raid some places for food and things like that. You know, he was raised by the Franciscans, I believe. It turned out that he was still working for a Spanish who raped his wife. He took him to court, and they could actually take people to court. But the court, when the Spanish had a lot of influence, they chose in favor of the Spanish. He got mad and started kind of rebelling like that. Oh, when he had to come down with his encomienda, he didn't show up. Yeah, he was supposed to come and serve the guy again, and he didn't show up, and that's when everything started. And that's why they started basically chasing him, finding him, and he started defending himself. And then they signed a treaty, and they survived. Anyway, it seems that in many parts of the Caribbean there might be families. In Puerto Rico, there were always families saying like grandma was an Indian. And that can mean many things. She looked like an Indian. They call her Ila India, but I think there's enough pattern that families had a tradition. Now, if they're descendants of the original Taínos or no in Puerto Rico,
Right.
But there's some tradition of Indian in some parts of the Caribbean. In the case of Cuba, up to the 1800s, there are documents talking about communities of Indians that are taking. A colleague of mine told me about that they took the government to court because they were claiming that the land where they live is theirs, and then they prepared the genealogy of their ancestors and everything. And in Cuba, there's more clear evidence than in Puerto Rico. In Dominican Republic, I think a little bit racism, a little bit of that hasn't been studied well enough, the documentary. But I have colleagues who they say that since they were little, isolated from the city, he didn't go to the city until much older, that they said they were Indians. Now, is that their main identity? I mean, they were proud of being Indian. My grandparents are on both sides are Lebanese. I'm proud of but Lebanese descendancy, and but I'm Puerto Rican more than Lebanese.
Right.
So identity is something funny because you have multiple identities, not personalities,
right.
identities,
right?
And they can be there can be a scale or a level. There's higher levels and lower levels. Like they consider Indians, but they consider themselves Dominican too. Or Dominican. So that there's politics, there's history, there's family tradition.
Right.
But I think Cuba especially because after Puerto Rico and Cuba started becoming colonized. The Spanish found Mexico and Peru. Nobody wanted to come to the Caribbean. So the colonization process in Cuba that's so big kind of got arrested. And it was slower after that, slowed down big time. And we have a site, Buchillones, for example, the one with the post and the wood. We have data of 1600s and I think close to 1700s there. So this is way past post Spanish occupation of the island.
Yeah. This is definitely a colonial. They didn't disappear after 1550 when the encomienda disappeared, but and they seem to have biologically survived and been assimilated, but culturally, the Taínos seem to have been maybe not completely, but largely disappeared.
Well, here I'm going to bring Fernando Ortiz from Cuba, right? Fernando Ortiz, an anthropologist and a well-respected around the world, and he's not alive. He's from the 50s or 70s, I think, and
30s.
He passed away.
He died
30s.
in.
Wow.
He was writing in the. This is Fernando Ortiz is this really big name in the Cuban social sciences. He wrote in the 20s, 30s, and 40s mostly, and he died, I think, in the 1960s.
I thought it was later than that. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I'm not Cuban, so but I admire him so much, and not that he's completely right on everything, but he was a genius definitely, and. As a Caribbeanist, when I mentioned how the Caribbean has been obviated by many other parts of the world in terms of anthropology, archaeology, Fernando Ortiz is the key because was a genius, a bright man. He talks about normally when you talk to people about Indians, they were acculturated, that another culture was imposed on them and they had to change. And it's true, there's some truth to it, but he claimed. Especially in Havana area, or when you see or in Cuba in general, between the African tradition, the European, and now we're seeing more and more Indian. That is, the road is two ways road. Where the exchange is not going from one culture to the other being imposed, which happens. Don't get me wrong, especially religion and the state, right? But Cuban society and Caribbean society is a mixing. It's almost like what we mentioned for the early Indians, the archaics and the ceramic people, all that stuff. They started mingling and mixing. In the Caribbean, this has been happening since from the beginning, and so I don't know. I see a lot of Indian, at least in food. Mm-hmm. Agriculture too, like a low level type of not I don't want to say that low level like it's so simple. Like conucos. Conucos are like it's a Taíno word. Milpa they call them in Mexico.
A plot of land.
It's a plot of land, but it's like a family.
Oh, the family plot. The
self-sustainable conuco.
Oh, that term is Taíno.
Yeah, it's a language. Yeah, yes, they call their farm field. So that tradition is there, and according to some colleagues, although this particular colleague, I have to double check and make sure, but he talks that there's also some religious beliefs, and I can see that. I mean, if voodoo is a mix of African and other things, that might have happened especially in the mountains, in places where the Catholic Church didn't have that much of a reach.
Right.
Know? I can see that happening in some places. So. I'm by nature. I was raised in the city, and that's one big deficiency I have. I mean, it's nobody's fault. That my view of Puerto Rico is what I saw when I was growing up, right? Yeah. But you go to the mountains, and there's different things going on. And Puerto Rico is small.
Yeah.
Did they say that already? Small in the mountains. There are some things. A colleague of mine did a really quick survey. Medicinal plants in the mountains are normally plants that are native. You go to the coast, you find more like European and African plants also mixed with native, and you see these small bits and pieces of things here and there. So I think we'll see more indigenous evidence in maybe in San Juan you won't find it, but if you go a little bit into other parts of Puerto Rico, you might see it. In Cuba, probably it's true too.
Yeah, probably that makes sense, especially since that same province which I mentioned, which is Holguín, where you still have, where the cassava is a staple of the end of the year feast. There you would still have. It's less since the revolution, which created 20th century houses for many people, and or at least tried to find them housing somewhere in an apartment. But before the revolution, you definitely had campesinos, peasants, in bohíos. That was still common until the 1950s, with many kids, with many homes actually having dirt floors as that late, and still having cassava and things like that. So that and their conuco, the family conuco. So this makes sense that there was a survival, even if they weren't necessarily conscious of the Taíno roots.
And actually, to show the two-way thing, many of them might be descendants of Spanish people, but the Spanish learned, they went to they were farmers, so they went and they kept using the techniques from the Indians too. So when we see conuco, sometimes it's a Spanish family that adopted local to be able to survive.
Right.
And actually, in if you go to the first town that the Spanish settle in Dominican Republic, is Isabela. La Isabela is the first town that Columbus established. So it's the first European town in the Americas. They were starving to death. And a colleague, Kathy Deegan from the University of Florida, studied the site with Jose Maria Crucent from Venezuela. They found almost no fish bones there. They found other things, and people were starving and getting sick and everything. And they were next to the ocean. So it seems, and then eventually they weren't eating local food. They weren't eating cassava. They weren't eating what the Indians were eating. And it's not until they start adopting that actually Columbus spread out the population and sends people to different villages to be fed by the Indians. And that's when they were able to survive. So it's not until they adopt that. So it could be both. That the Spanish were adopting their own techniques.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So this has been basically a 2-semester course crushed into
our audience
interview.
They're probably falling asleep now, I think.
No, I don't think so. I think you've made a very, very interesting explanation of these issues, which definitely in my own experience, and I studied Cuban history, the Taínos are presented as a bunch of people in huts. Then the Spanish came, the encomiendas happened, and then most history texts don't mention them ever again.
Right.
They are erased from Cuban history. They aren't, and where they are mentioned, they are certainly not treated necessarily with very much respect, or especially older texts. They're just treated as this happened. They had very low tech. They were assimilated. Who cares? And so this was an entire world with its own philosophies and visions, and they were not that technologically backwards. They had textiles, they had permanent housing, they had agricultural techniques. So this has been a very fascinating review. I just wanted to wrap up with 2 brief points. First, what in your field, which is archaeology, what do you see as one of a couple of the current major obstacles to advances in this topic?
I'm old enough to say what I'm going to say, I think. No, the people before us, like Rouse that you mentioned before, Rouse started his career in the Caribbean in the 30s. Okay, so he's a man of his time, and we have to keep in mind when we read this, and the emphasis there was chronology and putting people in boxes, like Taínos, and things like that, because they wanted to create the cultural history of the area, and it was very just treating things, not looking at the depth of society and culture. And then since I will say 80s, in other parts of the world, like in the U.S., and they started earlier, but in the 80s, in the Caribbean, some of us, I'm counting myself as one of the old ones, not old as Rouse, but we started kind of going deeper. And some of my colleagues have done marvelous, like the cosmology one, the marvelous work that is very complex, very sophisticated, and getting to the details of the information that we're getting, not just looking well, let me give you an example for what's happening today, what I think is happening today. But we were trying to analyze the data carefully and not only debunk myth, but make sure that we're not creating new myth, because that's what happens when you're not very rigorous. And some people think, oh, you're so picky, Antonio, about these things. It's like, if I'm going to make a statement, I better have a good argument, search all the evidence and everything. It's so easy to jump from finding one object and making all the story out of it. And it's not me, so there was a regeneration there that we were getting. But now what I'm seeing is that, and I said at least in Puerto Rico, that a lot of publications are coming without being rigorous. And let me use the example, and it's not only this, but the example of a greenstone that is being found in many of the islands now. Stone that is they make for amulets, sometimes axes, ceremonial axes probably, but some of it has been sourced to Guatemala, to the green jadeite from Guatemala, which is the one that the Mayas used, and Costa Ricans and everything. And for multiple reasons, people are arguing that they were exchanging across the Caribbean Sea, and only that, it was the chiefs that were the elite exchange. And you know what? This make a big difference in the cultural development of cultures of archaeological cultures in the Greater Antilles. And I look at and they start showing me things. And wow, yeah, looks like there's a connection. And I'm not denying that that's from Guatemala, and maybe some objects from Costa Rica made it to Puerto Rico. But the area of northern South America hasn't been studied that much. One argument they say is direct, because we don't find it that much in the land between Puerto Rico, let's say Puerto Rico, the Lesser Antilles, and northern South America. That area hasn't been studied that much. We're finding that jadeite in the Lesser Antilles now. But they were saying that was connecting. Okay, even if that's true, how do you go from there to caciques or the elites? Where's the evidence? Might be true, I'm not saying it's not, but where's the evidence? They're not showing me where was found, that the piece was, and nothing Caribbean has been found in Central America. And then, extrapolating like that, and I forgot this thing is that it was direct contact. Elite, I make a big difference in this cultural development of the islands, and I see it, and I see the jadeite, but the rest looks Caribbean to me.
Right.
So they're jumping to things and making it more, and then they start talking about the Gran Caribe or Greater Caribe, that Caribbean Sea, and they might be right, but it is jumping from one artifact to this whole thing without telling me where it was found. Right. So, iconography and so on.
Yeah, they're finding one thing which might point to a huge reinterpretation, and instead of taking that as, this is interesting, let's keep researching it and confirm this, they just kind of use that one piece of evidence and then extrapolate the rest.
Right. And a big contribution they did is showing that the Caribbean is in this network of trade, exchange, and everything, which normally people think islands are isolated, especially the Greater Antilles, and that's one contribution. But then I think they jump too much on those things, and this is an example of how people, in part nowadays, is because publish or perish. So people are it's so easy to do that, because the other way of doing it can take over a year to do the analysis, the detailed analysis and everything, looking at everything, and I don't think they're bad scholars. I think they're doing bad scholarship. They're good people.
Right. But I mean, there's also that structural pressure to just put something out and make it as attractive as possible.
I cannot speak for them, but that could be one of the issues, especially with young people. But it's happening. And I think it's happening in archaeology of other parts of the world too, because we're using a lot of high-tech stuff that can source things and so on. It's so easy. Oh yeah, we got it, and they start developing models without going to basic archaeological, like, detective work.
Yeah. And out of curiosity, the other question is, what are some of the recent either archaeological finds or major reinterpretations of the last few years that have really advanced the field?
Well, the thing I can think about, one is, I don't know, I published that article about the Taíno, the concept that we should stop using it, and I know so many people have commented on it, but I don't know what's the impact yet. I don't know in terms of reinterpreting things. I would call more advancements like in the cosmology thing that has been advanced a lot. Sourcing things is another one that has advanced, and we're seeing things. I think one thing that we have changed a lot is that these cultures were not simple. They were not isolated. They might not be, and I don't like talking about core or marginal, because for me, where I live is my core. It doesn't matter if I'm in an island, but I'm saying that they're not these marginal groups, that they started involved in exchange and networks and so on throughout, at least with South America. I'm not completely convinced with Central America. So they were a little bit metropolitan in a way, or cosmopolitan in a way, that they were going beyond their boundaries. You know. Now, how many of the people, if it's the elite, or because a farmer in the mountains probably is like a farmer in the mountains today, right? That they tend to be, so they know about these other places, but they're not connected. So we have to be careful. And I think there's so much new blood coming out, because the Caribbean used to be the backwaters of at least American archaeology. Nothing good is coming out of there. In part because Rouse's influence from the 30s stayed there until the 70s. So he was way behind. He was a great guy, great researcher. So, but
a man of his time.
Right, exactly. But now I think it's really great to see this a lot of people coming, new young people, and that's good. It's exciting. That's
perfect.
Yeah.
And well, I think this has been a very informative, very interesting conversation. Thank you for being with us.
No, thank you. This was an honor for me. So thank you.
Thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Ask Historians podcast and our special guest, Antonio Curet, archaeologist and curator at the Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. This topic has been near and dear to my heart for some time, and I'm really glad that Professor Curet took time out of his schedule to talk to us about it, because it's long bothered me how the Taíno have been treated even in academia. It's not too surprising that in popular media, the depictions aren't always accurate. In fact, sometimes they're quite inaccurate. The Taíno often just simply playing the role of the noble or innocent savage. What is far more surprising is that even in academia, my personal experience in Cuban academia, the books on Cuban history often give very little attention to the Taíno, both before the arrival of Columbus and in particular after. There's a small window of time, at least in Cuban historiography, where there's a good deal of attention paid to the indigenous peoples of the island, and that's the time between the initial colonization and around halfway through the 16th century, when the encomienda, which was a forced labor system for the indigenous population, was dismantled formally. But after that, the Taíno largely disappear from most histories of Cuba. I will stress that again, most histories of Cuba. Thanks to work by Professor Curet and his colleagues and the countless researchers that came before them, we're slowly inching towards seeing the Taíno as human beings, their culture as a civilization, the Taíno civilization of the Caribbean, and slowly inching away from seeing the Taíno as a simplistic culture which isn't really worthy of much reflection or research, or representing the Taíno as a sort of idealized noble savage. I can only hope that the research done by archaeologists on the Taíno will slowly spread not only throughout academia, but also escape from specialized journals on archaeology or anthropology, make its way into popular consciousness. I'd like to conclude this episode by thanking our supporters on Patreon. You can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/AskHistorians. You can find the main subreddit at www.reddit.com/r/AskHistorians. You can also find us on Twitter at AskHistorians. If you've enjoyed the episode, please feel free to share it with your friends and family. You can find the main discussion of the episode on the subreddit in the official thread for the episode. We hope you'll join us in 2 weeks for the next episode of the Ask Historians podcast.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.